This is the first lecture for Friday, April 10th. Continuing our survey of marine ecosystems, looking at the open ocean, oceanic ecosystems, as opposed to those close to shore, coastal ecosystems. And we've gotten to this point where we're looking at migration and dispersal. And we've looked at a number of aspects of migration, realizing that these aren't all limited to oceanic ecosystems, but there's aspects of migration and dispersal that are relevant to other marine ecosystems, those close to shore. This is where we got the other day, was up to the point where we're talking about migration for marine organisms that go back and forth between freshwater and seawater, or at least spend part of their time in freshwater and part of their time in saltwater. So basically the pattern is that you can spend most of your life in freshwater and then migrate out to saltwater, or the other way around. You can primarily be a marine species, but then migrate back to freshwater for a short period of time. And these migrations are between very different habitats in terms of salinity, obviously, but you're talking about a river or a stream, very shallow water, miles from the ocean, versus the ocean, sometimes way out in the middle of nowhere. So these marine organisms, they could be characterized as diadromous, which means they occupy two bodies of water, freshwater and seawater. Now, some of these diadromous, it's really, really freshwater, and it's really, really seawater, full-strength seawater. Other ones, a little more on the boundary, on the border of, it might not be all the way out into the ocean, but on the edge of the ocean. But there are quite a few of them that migrate from the ocean up into freshwater, and they spawn. And a lot of times they die right after they spawn. There's other ones that live in freshwater, and they migrate out of the ocean and spawn there. So that's the classic migration, is a feeding area and an area for reproduction, or an area where the juveniles thrive and an area where the adults thrive. So it's not just a seasonal migration necessarily. A point that I was making before, that these migrations might take place years apart. They spend 2 years, 3 years, 4 years in the ocean, and then at the end of their life, basically, they're making this migration up into seawater, freshwater. So some major patterns, general patterns anyway. If you're looking at higher latitudes, then what you tend to find in colder water is that the fish spend more of the time in the ocean, more productive waters, and then they migrate into freshwater to spawn. That's typically what you find at higher latitudes, both in the north and the south, away from the equator. What you find at lower latitudes, where the ocean isn't as productive, maybe freshwater is a better habitat for fish to occupy, then the adults are found in freshwater and they move down to the ocean to spawn. Now there's exceptions to these, of course, but these are generalizations that are true for a lot of different species. Think about where's the optimal habitat for adults, where there's all this food, versus where is there a safe habitat, or a habitat where the young have an advantage. It's advantageous for the young, either for protection or for availability of food or for dispersal. Then you have these two different bodies of water that are occupied. So there's three major patterns of diadromous. Diadromous just means that they occupy these two bodies of water. There are a lot of species that are anadromous, a lot of different anadromous species, salmon and some smaller fish. And it's pretty common for that type of behavior. So we'll look at some of those. There's some catadromous fish as well that live in freshwater, move out to seawater to spawn or move in between fresh bodies of fresh water. But there's a marine component of their life. And then there's this small group, which doesn't include that many species, but it's a lot more obscure. It tends to be in the warmer water, tropical waters, where they spend most of their life in fresh water. And that is amphidromous. Well, they move between seawater and freshwater, but it's not the adults that are moving. It's the offspring. The adults move down close to the ocean, but it's not such a drastic migration between freshwater and saltwater. We'll look at these amphidromous and see what that pattern of migration is. Anadromous species, though. There's a lot of different species of these. As I said, the classic anadromous fish are salmon. On the west coast of the U.S., other parts of the world, salmon live for years in the ocean, and then when they reach 3 years, 4 years of age, then they migrate to the stream where they hatched out. They can smell the stream. They can navigate to the stream very precisely to where they started. And then they spawn in those locations, in the rivers, far away from the ocean sometimes. There's also smaller filter feeders, bait fish like alewives that we have here on the East Coast. Striped bass move up not into pure fresh water so much, but into estuaries, brackish water. Sturgeon do this as well. And then lampreys are similar to salmon in terms of how far upstream they go. So looking at some anadromous fish, there's the Oregon and Washington, the beautiful Pacific Northwest on the west coast of the U.S. Those purple lines represent rivers, tributaries, streams, the waterways basically where these salmon spawn. They swim all the way upstream. You can see they're going all the way up the mighty Columbia River all the way into the Snake River, into Idaho even, and parts of Montana. Now that's a long ways from the ocean. So they spend most of their life out in the ocean. And then at the end of their life, they spawn, they swim sometimes a few miles, sometimes hundreds of miles into fresh water. Now, a lot of the rivers there are dammed, so they block the passage of the fish. They have to put fish ladders. There has to be some mechanism for the fish getting past these dams. It's great for electricity. It's great for irrigation, but not so good for these fish that have been migrating like this, spawning in freshwater for millions of years. In the Atlantic, you've got these Atlantic salmon, very different. First of all, they don't die after they spawn. And second of all, they have this a lot less deliberate movement between freshwater and seawater. That's what Atlantic salmon do. They do move into these rivers, into the St. Lawrence River upstream, but it's very different on the east coast of the U.S. than it is with this classic anadromous fish on the west coast. Here's some other ones. You've got alewives. They swim upstream, not very far from the ocean, but they do make their way up there. And you've got shad that do the same thing. Striped bass to a certain degree. They move up, as I said, into rivers, little ways, but not way up into the river, hundreds of miles. But they come into the estuaries, brackish water, to spawn. And then you've got these sturgeon that move up, far up into the rivers. They don't really go out in the open ocean so much. That's not what their life is. They are out there along the shore, the coast, and they're moving between rivers for the most part. So those are a common anadromous fish on the East Coast. On the West Coast, like I said, salmon. Salmon is king. And you've also got trout that if they move out into the ocean, they're considered steelhead. Then there's some catadromous species of fish, not quite as common. And you'll notice that this migration, seawater to freshwater, this diadromous migration, is limited primarily to fish, bony fish. So these catadromous, now they tend to be at lower latitudes, but not always. Eels are pretty high latitude. There's eels all over Rhode Island. The Narrow River in Narragansett has a lot of eels in it, but they spend most of their life in freshwater. They move up down to the ocean to spawn. And then the young is larval young. They develop in the ocean. They're dispersing in the ocean. They're moving around. And then they move back into freshwater where when they reach a certain age, a certain size, and that's where they spend their adult life. Now this eel spawning, the American eel, there's a European eel as well that does a similar thing. This was a mystery for a while. Where did these eels spawn? Where did they go? And so you couldn't track these eels. You couldn't really follow them around. So they've derived a lot of information from trawls, where they're out dragging nets through the water, seeing how big these eels are that they catch in their net at different times of the year. And so this is the type of distribution of different sizes of eels that are found at different times of the year, where it says eel size versus location. You can see they start out in the Sargasso Sea, which was postulated that that's where they spawned for a while, but wasn't a huge amount of information supporting that. But it's been demonstrated that there's these little leaf-like, the Leptocephalus eel larvae, get bigger and bigger and bigger, and as they get bigger, they're moving farther and farther north, and then they're at the stage where they're ready to move into fresh water. So it's something that we have around here quite a bit. And then these amphidromous. Now adults live in freshwater, tend to be at low latitudes, warm water, the tropics anyway, and they migrate downstream to the mouth of the rivers. They're not even rivers a lot of times, they're streams. And then they lay their eggs there. Now, the eggs hatch in the freshwater. The larvae don't spend their time in freshwater, but they allow themselves to they're spawned in a certain area where they're easily swept down into the ocean. They don't go far out into the ocean, but they're still in the ocean as larvae, and they're planktonic larvae. So there can be some distribution of these, but they're not going out into the open ocean being swept away hundreds and hundreds of miles like a lot of larvae. It's a very short distance from the water, the fresh water. And then a couple of months later, they start moving upstream. So that there is movement between freshwater and seawater, so they're diadromous, but the adults aren't doing the moving between freshwater and seawater. The adults move down close to the ocean, but it's the developing larvae that actually move. It's just a short distance, but they're the ones that move between freshwater and seawater, and then they move back into freshwater after a short period of time. One of the best examples is the Hawaiian gobies, O'opu. In other Pacific islands, there's stream gobies that exhibit these same type of migrations. So here's a couple of these different O'opu. There's a number of different species. Some of them are endemic to different islands in Hawaii. Some of them are endemic to different streams even. So as I said, when they get out in the ocean, they're not making huge distant moves. They move a relatively short period of time, short distance. So if you start out as a larva, looking at this figure, let's say the larva, where it says larvae remain in the oceanic plankton for up to 6 months, several months, these larvae. And then they develop, they get bigger and bigger, and then as juveniles, they move into the streams, into the estuaries at first. These gobies have suction cups on the ventral side of their body, so they can climb up waterfalls. They can climb up very steep bodies of water up these streams, farther and farther up the streams, and then that's where they live as adults. They lay their eggs up there. The eggs hatch out, and these plankton are swept downstream. These little planktonic larvae, anyway, are swept downstream into the ocean. So that is amphidromous. It is movement between freshwater and seawater, but it's different in the respect that it's not the adults that are doing the moving, especially for reproduction at the end, like the catadromous and anadromous fish are. Okay, well, this takes us to this topic of dispersal. Dispersal, very common behavior, very important for the dispersal of all kinds of different marine organisms. All these different marine invertebrates that are stuck to the rocks, that crawl around on the rocks. If they wouldn't have a very wide distribution, they wouldn't have access to different habitat if they didn't disperse like this, if they didn't have these planktonic larvae to be able to take advantage of water currents and waves, water movement, to greatly increase the distance that they were dispersing. So what dispersal, first of all, is the spread of offspring. Now there's dispersal in plants. Plants have different dispersal mechanisms, the wind and water and animals. In these marine organisms, it's mostly as larvae, planktonic larvae, that are dispersed around by ocean currents. So that's what we're going to focus on mostly. And we're going to look at these 8 different things. We're going to look at dispersal in quite a bit of detail. So again, some of this, well, quite a bit of it, has to do with the oceanic ecosystems. But some of this obviously doesn't have to do, it's not exclusively oceanic. There's a lot of coastal ecosystems where that involves this dispersal as well. So we're going to look at this, just dispersal. I talked about what it was, why the advantages of undergoing dispersal, and then these 8 other things as well. So to begin with, what is dispersal in the first place? As I said, it's movement of individuals within a population. There's different types of dispersal. There's animals that are grown up that are dispersing. There's immature, but they could be several years old before they start dispersing. But what we're focusing our attention on is natal dispersal. So these young that are, it could be seeds that are dispersed in the case of plants, or it could be larvae is what we're mostly talking about in marine animals. So this dispersal, you could have individuals that move into a population or individuals that move out of a population. And there's advantages for this type of movement. And so let's look at this. The advantage of dispersing. Now, keep in mind that most of what we're talking about, let's say you've got a starfish, you've got a sea anemone, you've got a coral, you've got an urchin, something like that. You've got a crab, you've got a lobster. Well, these reproduce by spawning. They have eggs that are fertilized outside of the body of the parents. Those eggs hatch out. They turn into larvae. They're in the water column. And then, depending on how long they're in the water column, how much food they have, whether they actually feed as larvae, or whether the only source of energy they have is the yolk that they got from the mother, they can be distributed around for different lengths of time and different distances. So this planktonic larva, very, very common. I've mentioned it a number of times, and here's a quantification of that in terms of marine invertebrates and a whole bunch of fish, a lot of fish that lay eggs, not sharks, skates, rays that give live birth. have planktonic larvae. Look at the number, the proportion of marine species that have planktonic larvae. There are a lot, especially invertebrates. All these different invertebrates and all these different fish have planktonic larvae, or natal dispersal is what we're talking about. So if you have these little planktonic larvae, that's how you're reproducing. That's what your young start out as. And there's advantages for dispersal. You're spreading out, spacing. We all know how important that is these days to have some social distancing. They can occupy a range of habitats, a range of areas. So the more widely you're dispersed, the greater the chances that you as a species is going to survive and not go extinct. The more narrow your distribution is, the fewer habitats that you occupy, then the greater risk you are of going extinct, the greater risk you have of going extinct. Also, you can occupy different habitats, different locations, different bays, estuaries, different rocks, outcroppings, depends on where you are. But there's a number of, you're around, and there's a lot of you as larvae. Somebody's going to settle in the right place. Somebody's going to make it. And the more variety there is, then the greater chance that your species is going to survive and thrive. So ultimately what you're trying to do is keep the species from going extinct, keep the species going, and so that it'll persist over time. And dispersal is a very good mechanism for achieving that. So how do you disperse? Well, I talked about plants. You're probably familiar with plants. They produce these things that are distributed in the wind, sometimes long distances. They produce these things that are good to eat, or that attract some kind of animal that eats them, or they get stuck to their claws, or they get stuck to their feathers. There's little burrs that get stuck on things. There's a number of different mechanisms for dispersal through animals. But what we're focusing on are these marine organisms and dispersal as a result of the movement of water, primarily currents. These currents can move a long ways, long distance in a relatively short period of time. If these larvae hatched out and were just floating in the water column, they're plankton, so they're not going to go very far. 100 feet might be quite a distance for little plankton to move. But when you're swept away by the current, then you're not talking about 100 feet. You could be talking about 100 miles or 1,000 miles, depending on how long you can stay in the water column. So these things, these reproductive units, offspring, larvae, seeds, whatever it is, if you're talking about plants, you describe them one way. If you're talking about animals, you describe them another way. They're propagules, seeds or larvae, rather than the adults, rather than a miniature version of the adults like you have in sharks. So they're the things that are involved in that natal dispersal, as opposed to dispersal of the rest of the population. Well, let's look at this topic of dispersal. How is dispersal accomplished? So first of all, you've got seeds blown around in the wind. You've got things that are eaten, bananas, seeds, fruit, things like that. And then you've got all these fish, larval fish. And then look at these different marine invertebrates. So we've looked at, you've got starfish or sea stars, sea urchins, those echinoderms. You've got tunicates that have snails, bryozoans. You look at lobster, crustaceans, a whole bunch of different organisms that have these larvae that are involved in this type of dispersal. So the most common mechanism involved here is that you've got an egg, a fertilized egg, and then the egg hatches. and then you've got some planktonic larva. This larva is going to develop over time. They have different developmental stages, different developmental lengths, different lengths of time that they're developing. And so you're in the water column and you're moving around. You're being swept by the current. So there's some advantages for being swept back to where the adults came from, because if the adults are there, that's good habitat. There's some advantage for being swept away from the adults, that you're expanding the distribution of the species. You're presented with opportunities to find new sites where you can establish a population, those kind of things. So if you're looking at different organisms, small organisms with small eggs and that are attached to the bottom, not very much nutrition for the young, for these larvae, they tend to be dispersed over relatively short distances. 10 meters, 10 hours maybe in the water column before they settle. There's other things that can disperse a lot farther, 100 kilometers, 100 days, months that these larvae can be in the water column. And there's different mechanisms for supplying nutrition to these larvae. They can either just get what they are delivered from their mother yolk that is going to last them for a certain period of time, or some larvae, as we'll see, they feed. So they use up their yolk and then they're still hungry. They're still not where they're going to settle. And so they start feeding on plankton. So the spawning sites for some things, especially fish can move around, and they choose spawning sites that have been selected for over thousands of years, millions of years, and that favor the movement of the larva in a certain direction. Sometimes that's back to where the adults were, as I said. Sometimes it's taking them farther away. So for instance, if you're looking at barnacles, these barnacles, they're not moving anywhere to spawn. They're stuck to the rocks, and they're going to spawn right where they live. So these larval barnacles go out into the ocean, into the water column, but there's these gyres that tend to move them not away from shore. What are you going to do if you're a barnacle and you don't have any place to settle if you're in deep water? But these gyres are pretty common, and they bring them right back to shore. There's also places where fish spawn where there's these onshore currents that will bring the larvae onshore. So they might move offshore to spawn, but there's currents that tend to move them onshore. So that's the kind of thing that you see in terms of this idea of if the adults are someplace and the adults are surviving just fine, then maybe that's a good place for the larvae to settle and not strike out on your own in some new habitat that's probably not going to be good. Come back to the same place that your parents are. So ultimately, how far you're going to go as a larva depends on how long you can stay in the water column. And I've mentioned this a number of times, that if all you have is your source of energy is the yolk that you have, then you're going to be in the larva form. You're going to be in a planktonic larva for a limited period of time. If you can use up that yolk and go through these different developmental stages and get to the point where you can feed on larvae, now that's a whole other situation. You can stay in the water column for months potentially. So basically, you hatch out, you have the source of nutrition. It might last you for a number of hours. It might last you for a number of months. But the cycle that you go through as a larva is dependent on the number of larval stages that you go through. There's a transition sometimes, as I said, of you're dependent on yolk, and then you're a feeder. You're a predator. And then the type of nourishment as well. So that's a good introduction. This is about 30 minutes, this lecture on migration to begin with, finishing up migration, freshwater, seawater, diadromous migration, and then these first parts of dispersal. So what we have left in the second lecture is to look at 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. That's what we'll do in lecture number 2.